So today we're going to talk about some times in US history where America has gone to war based on false intelligence or media sensationalism or just outright lies. And this is especially important right now as tensions between the US and Iran continue to get worse. It seems likely that war with Iran is potentially right around the corner. And it's important for the American people to look at how the US and the media have manipulated the population in the past to support wars throughout American history. And we're going to start with the Spanish American War all the way back in 1898 because this is really the beginning of journalism as we know it today. You know, obviously, the media has been pushing war long before this, but the modern day kind of media frenzy that we know today really have its origins in the Spanish American War. That's because popular newspapers began pushing for war because they realized they would sell more copies of their newspapers, specifically in New York City, because the newspaper industry in New York City was extremely competitive at the time. There were a ton of different outlets, all trying to gain the attention of the readers. So, for some background on the Spanish American War, basically, Cuba had erupted into revolution following, the weakening of the Spanish Empire after the Napoleonic Wars, after the wars of, Latin American independence. Some Spanish colonies remained part of Spain. This included Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So Cuba erupted into a revolution, and Cuba, to keep in mind, is just, I think, like 90 miles off the coast of Florida, is very close. So obviously, this kind of concerned the U.S. The Spanish had responded to this Cuban revolution by crushing the Cuban peasantry and setting up what was basically concentration camps to maintain power over the Cuban peasant class. The U.S. was being urged by business elites who had invested in the Cuban sugar industry and just in the Cuban infrastructure in general. Keep in mind how close it is to the U.S. They were losing profits and wanted to intervene in the revolution to stop it. The Cuban people did actually want U.S. intervention, which is interesting that the U.S. has intervened in many countries before who certainly did not want intervention. This may be one exception. The Cuban people definitely saw Spain as a tyrannical government, much like the early United States saw the British as a tyrannical ruler against America. President McKinley decided to send the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to ensure that U.S. interests were maintained in Cuba. And in February 15th, 1998, the USS Maine sank in the Havana harbor, killing 250 out of the 355 U.S. sailors. The U.S. initially said that the cause of the explosion was unknown, but the Navy's investigation concluded on March 28th that the ship's powder magazines were ignited when an internal explosion was set off under the ship's hull. So basically, they accused Spain of exploding the ship. This transformed public opinion and made the war almost inevitable. Spain, however, came to the opposite conclusion that it was an internal explosion. They hadn't exploded the ship. Experts have since concluded that the explosion was almost certainly internal, meaning the Spanish were not responsible. But nonetheless, this drove public opinion and war was eventually declared. While the war may have been somewhat justifiable in protecting the Cuban people from the Spanish concentration camps, where tens of thousands of Cuban people were dying, this was certainly not the reason behind it. I mean, we know this for a fact because during the Philippine-American War, immediately following the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. took over the Philippines, as well as Cuba and Puerto Rico. But during this war, between 250,000 to 1 million Filipino civilians died. The U.S. went to war with Spain to liberate the Cuban people and the Puerto Rican and Filipino people from tyranny, only to be tyrants themselves. The Filipino-American War was one of the greatest in a long history of atrocities. Brutal concentration camps were widespread. Torture tactics were also used. The same journalists who covered the atrocities committed by the Spanish against the Cubans were not as interested when the U.S. was committing atrocities in the Philippines. That most certainly far exceeded the Spanish atrocities in Cuba. It's an obvious bias that the media does, downplaying U.S. atrocities while condemning foreign nations who, in recent history, have been following our lead in the atrocity spectrum. Basically, it was the media who frenzied around war with Cuba. They saw it as an opportunity to expand the media's influence on the public. This was the first time the media really took advantage of warfare and the military to profit themselves. This is what happens now. You have this really strong relationship between the corporate media class, those Washington insiders, and the military. I mean, you have retired military people going into media, into roles on major cable news networks, spewing propaganda, doing exactly what they're supposed to keep the media in power, to keep ratings high, all while pushing for far right interventionism. And it starts right here in the Spanish-American War. Now we're going to jump all the way to the Vietnam War, where unlike in the Spanish-American War, where President McKinley didn't initially want to go to war, in the Vietnam War, war was already being pushed for many years prior. JFK in the early 60s was already invading South Vietnam. Johnson certainly wanted to go to war. And the first the Gulf of Tonkin incident was basically fabricated by the U.S. to directly escalate the tensions and to get Congress to declare war. And then, of course, also to sway public opinion. So the first Gulf of Tonkin incident was when a U.S. destroyer named the USS Maddox, while on patrol, was pursued by 3 North Vietnam torpedo boats. The Maddox fired at the boat. This expanded into a sea battle, which resulted in the deaths of 4 North Vietnamese sailors and 6 more were injured. There were no U.S. casualties, and the Maddox was essentially unharmed. So this was a direct U.S. attack. Of course, the North Vietnamese torpedo boats were pursuing the Maddox, so we can't really say it was completely unprovoked, but it was certainly the U.S. who fired first. This certainly wasn't an act of war by North Vietnam. 3 destroyers following 1 U.S. ship certainly is not an act of war. No U.S. soldiers were killed, even though 4 Vietnamese soldiers were. And this even worse first Gulf of Tonkin incident, 2 days later, in the second Gulf of Tonkin incident, there was supposedly another sea battle, but literally no one has actually seen or heard it happening. By all accounts, it was completely fabricated and imaginary. Literally, it never happened. Yet, even still, the media ran away with these stories. They were used by President Johnson to get Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which began the huge escalation of the Vietnam War under false and imaginary incidents. Literally, no U.S. lives were killed, and the second incident was a complete farce. In the Vietnam War, between 1.3 and 4.3 million people would be killed, mostly Vietnamese peasants, with 59,000 American soldiers being killed, many of them drafted. Also, another 1.8 to 2.5 million Cambodians would die in the Cambodian genocide as a result of the Vietnam War. All started under false pretenses laid out by the U.S. government, specifically President Johnson. And these two examples aren't the only ones. You have both the first and the second Iraq War. During the first Iraq War, also known as the Gulf War, began under false pretenses. It was fought against Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. Famously, a 15-year-old girl named Nayyirah gave testimony to the Congressional Human Rights Caucus in 1990. She only provided her first name, coincidentally. The testimony was widely publicized by the media and cited many times by Bush Sr. for entering the Gulf War. In 1992, it was revealed that Nahir's last name was al-Sabah. Sorry, I'm definitely not pronouncing that right, but she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., so obviously a huge conflict of interest there. She was the daughter to a Kuwaiti citizen, a pro-Kuwaiti official. Iraq was invading Kuwait, so obviously she and the Kuwaiti government had a vested interest in seeing the U.S. Defend Kuwait against the Iraqi invasion. It's not as cut and dry as Iraq simply invading Kuwait, although I would obviously say that Kuwait was the defender in this incident. We're not going to get into, I'll just say right now, we're not going to get into whether any of these wars were justifiable. I'll just say that they were all, we got into all of them under false pretenses. Anyway, so what did Nayyirah say? So in her testimony, she said that in the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, she saw babies taken out of incubators in a Kuwaiti hospital and left to die. Like 20 or so babies were supposedly taken out of their incubators and killed. This was completely false. Her testimony was organized by the Citizens for a Free Kuwait, which was a U.S. campaign run by the firm Hill and Knowlton, funded by the Kuwaiti government. So obviously it was completely fabricated. The Bush administration used this false intelligence, false testimony many, many times to justify the war in Iraq. And then really the irony to me here is that his son, Bush Jr., did the same thing just like 10 years later in the second Iraq war. I mean, this is ridiculous. You have Bush Sr.'s son, Bush Jr., fighting the exact same person, Saddam Hussein, in Iraq, and once again justifying the war under completely false pretenses. So in the second Iraq war in 2003, Bush Jr. lied to the American people to wage war. After being defeated in the first Iraq war by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., Saddam Hussein was forced to give up his weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein, I mentioned this in my Iran video, but he had a huge chemical weapons program. He used chemical weapons against Iran in the Iraq-Iran war. Horrible person. But the Bush administration falsely claimed that Saddam Hussein had active weapons of mass destruction and also supported Al-Qaeda, and so therefore was partially responsible for 9/11. This was completely false, completely fabricated by the Bush administration. They absolutely did not have weapons of mass destruction. Bush was definitely fully aware of this. Their weapons of mass destruction were taken away after the first Iraq war, and they had not developed weapons since then. This has been confirmed many times since then, and it's also been confirmed that Saddam Hussein never supported Al-Qaeda. There's no evidence to support this. It's completely false. But Bush did this to sway public opinion to enter the Iraq War, another war where this time 150 to 600,000 Iraqis were killed in just the first 3 to 4 years of war, and another massive torture campaign soon followed. Just another brutal regime change war that America supported, where tens of thousands, if not millions of people die. I mean, we're still in Iraq. It's basically a failed state at this point. There's no immediate plan to leave Iraq, and no exit strategy whatsoever that I've seen. Obama falsely promised to leave Iraq and Afghanistan. That was not true. So we're still there after like I don't even know, 16 years or so, 18 years in Afghanistan. So even with a First Amendment right, it is not difficult for propaganda to cause the U.S. to go to war. We must always remain vigilant to lies coming from the sensationalized media and directly from the White House and Congress. Don't trust people in power just because they say something. They all have vested interests in different things, but many of them have a vested interest in the U.S. continuing our policy of regime change wars throughout the world, being pro-military industrial complex, being funded by private military contract companies. Many of the people of Congress retire and end up as lobbyists for pro-military groups or are hired for defense contractors. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, the obvious corruption that Congress does. So we need to stay vigilant for incoming lies about Iran. It's very likely to happen. We already might be experiencing it with the disputed intelligence of who blew up these oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. Trump easily could have used this as his own USS Maine or his own Gulf of Tonkin incident. We shouldn't trust Trump or the intelligence community. They all have their own interests at heart at the end of the day. So stay vigilant and peace to all of you. See you.